this special edition of our Crossfire, but in this case, during this commemoration, we'll have different discussions with different people, not meant to be fire, but more insight, getting deeper into the different topics that we will take on during our series, during this 22nd commemoration of the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda. And I'm welcome to this show, Jean-Paul Kimonyo.
Thank you.
Dr. Jean-Paul Kimonyo,
yes.
right? And Dr. Phil Clark.
Morning.
Morning. I mean, the style of the show is no protocol, but I'm very excited to host you, both of you guys, because you are researchers and you've been publishing about the recent history, actually, of Rwanda, that everybody has, in these last 22 years, linked to the events that happened in '94, exceptional, even in I would say in the history of mankind in general, because we're talking about a genocide. To introduce you, Dr. Phil Clark, you are a researcher and you are, I would say, familiar with these events, as you've been also especially treating the Gacaca, if I remember well.
Yes, that's right. I wrote a book about 5 or 6 years ago, sort of analysing the impact of the Gacaca process, especially on the hills, sort of in rural areas. But I've been fortunate enough to be coming to Rwanda since 2003 and seeing an enormous amount of change in this country for 12 or 13 years now. So it's always a pleasure to be back.
And if there was Gacaca, it's because there was also a genocide in '94. And you, Jean-Paul, you wrote a book. In the US and the UK, I guess, and in English it's called a bit like the French, the Rwanda, a popular genocide, a perfect storm.
Exactly.
The most rapid, the fastest development in killings that happened in just about 100 days.
Absolutely.
And Phil, you've read the book already.
I have, and I think it's a really excellent book.
Yeah, what's your review on that?
I think I was lucky enough actually to be a discussant about the book at a big research event held by the Aegis Trust at the Kigali Genocide Memorial on Monday night, and I had a chance to talk about Jean-Paul's book. And I think the big contribution that it makes is to give us a much deeper insight into the local mechanics of the genocide. So actually what was happening in depth in parts of, in those days, Butare and Kiboye prefectures. So whereas a lot of the literature on the genocide takes a big picture and talks about the national events, Jean-Paul's book really goes into depth and tells us what local people were doing in the build-up to 1994 and of course during the genocide itself. So it's a really enormous contribution to our understanding of the genocide. Jean-Paul,
it has the title. It didn't change from French to English, because that is really, in fact, I would say, for having read the book on myself also, it's fundamental. You describe the genocide in a way that maybe people were not aware of, that it was in fact a popular genocide. What does that mean for, in fact, to share with our viewers?
Yes, I think it's one of the unique features of the genocide in Rwanda. Indeed, I would say that the 94 genocide has two very specific characteristics. First, it's a total genocide, meaning that the aim of those who committed genocide of exterminating almost the entire population has almost been achieved, with about 75% of the target population being killed. That's this one thing. And that makes Rwanda not unique, because also you have the Holocaust, you have the genocide against the Armenians, but you also have the genocide against the Herero, which were also total genocide, which is different from different genocide we have been seeing, especially now. Now maybe that people are more aware or sensitive to those kind of crimes, we can see that there's a quite important occurrence of genocide or genocide crimes. But usually it's partial genocide, or let's say genocide, but not total genocide. Total genocide is something special, something particular. That's one thing that is specific to the Rwandan genocide, but as I said, specific, but shared with other important genocide. And then the second one is the fact that the genocide has been carried out mostly by the population itself. And that's why I talk about the mass participation of the population in committing the genocide. And I define popular participation in two ways. There's first people who killed directly, or were direct accomplices of killers. There are more than 200,000 people, which already is very important. And second, it is the indirect participation to the genocide, with people controlling physically the population. Rwanda is a small country. You cannot find more than 100 kilometers between the center of Rwanda with the international border. At the time, there was 10 prefectures, and 9 of them had an international border, and there was no logistics prepared for jailing the intended victims. There's no means of transport for the killers or even for the victims. So who did the physical control of the population? Because you have to physically control them. If you don't physically control them, they would have fled to outside. So you have to stop people in the country. And who did that? It's the population itself. So that's why also explain that this, especially the second element of participation, was so crucial, because without that, you wouldn't have a total genocide, and we wouldn't have also have a genocide as intense and quick as it has been.
So this popular participation, just to clarify, in other situations, in fact, the genocide have been perpetrated by a group, military or paramilitary or a party or stuff. But here, what makes it unique is the fact that, in fact, everybody was involved in the execution of the whole plan.
This does mean that military, soldiers, policemen, and other specific groups were not involved. They were involved, but not at as much as the general population itself.
So, okay, but then, according to you, how do you come to such a situation that a population? Do you agree with this perspective, by the way, Phil?
I do, and I think...
Because that comes back in the Gacaca.
Indeed, and I think that was a really key part of the Gacaca process, was individuals at the local level coming to terms with the fact that they were the reason that the genocide had happened. You know, without their active participation, we would never have seen killings on the scale that we did. And I think there are two big things in Jean-Paul's book, which, to be honest, internationally we didn't really know before. And I would see his contribution really in two main ways. The first one is to highlight that there was a very important build-up of low-level violence in key parts of the country, even before the beginning of the Civil War in 1990. And that is something that I don't think any other scholar has really emphasized, that it's not as though the Civil War and the genocide came out of nowhere. Actually, there had been a very slow rumble of violence, particularly violence driven by poverty and socioeconomic factors, which then created the conditions that made the Civil War and the genocide possible. So I think that pre-1990 analysis is something that Jean-Paul is quite right widely emphasizing. And then I think the second thing that he really shows us in this book that we didn't really know enough about before was the very important role that political parties played in creating violent contestation at the local level. So that a lot of the violence leading up to 1994 was about particularly Hutu-dominated extremist political parties like branches of the MRND and branches of the MDR fighting for control on the edges of the country in the countryside, and that was something that elites were able to manipulate and created the conditions for this kind of popular involvement in violence. So these are two things that I don't think internationally at least we understood enough about in relation to the genocide in 1994.
Jean-Paul, but how do we then get there? Like you were saying, there were some elements, in fact, were maturing prior to the 90s, apparently. So can you tell us a bit more?
Yes. I think that we arrived to that situation that's quite unique because there was factors at the time that was radicalized. There is first extreme poverty. People don't talk about it, I think, enough, but before the end of the 80s, Rwanda was the poorest country in the world. To the extent, for example, that the
end of 80s,
the economy, peasant economy, just break down completely.
Because of what?
Because of overpopulation, because of drought, repetitive drought, and disease, plant disease. There's a number of issues, but the main issue was overpopulation and the fact that land available for our peasants gets smaller and smaller, so they couldn't, after a while, they couldn't feed themselves. But this is extreme. To the extent that the life expectancy, for example, in 1990 was 42. 42 is the lowest ever recorded life expectancy since 96, except for 2 years for Sierra Leone between 66 and 68. But this means that in a time of peace, with no natural disaster, the country was experiencing something disastrous, very strong. So even before the civil war of October 19, if you look at the Rwanda social and political landscape, there's two things that really struck out Rwanda. First is this poverty, really, that is so strong. And second is a radical, exclusive ideology. So when you put the two together, and then you bring a third one with a political class that wants to exploit that situation, that's when you get this situation, which is extreme, totally particular.
What is this radical ideology you're talking about? Like ethnical?
Ethnical, of course. The ethnical ideology of exclusion that was being established in 1959
yes,
by the Hutu.
But all of this time, what was the weight anyway of the excluded group?
What is the weight of
the weight in the society, or for that to become a factor? What was the weight of this exclusion? What impact could it have on the society? Because all of this time, I had never heard of any ethnical tension because of just that a part of society seems to have been accepted to be second-class citizens.
Absolutely. But then there is something that Philippe just mentioned, is the fact that at the end of the 80s, when this social and economic condition became so bad, disorder started to mount and violence started to mount in society. In the end of the 80s, our hills were extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. You could get killed for almost anything. And when people are getting so hungry and desperate, that's when some of these issues become more salient. By the way, even before 90 and the genocide and exploitation of the situation by political elites, up to 90, there was no ethnic tension on the hills, almost.
Exactly.
But there was a lot of social tension, a lot of killings, not killings between Hutu and Tutsi, killings within families, between neighbors. You come and you cultivate 1 meter on my plot, I react with a machete. Yeah. During the recurrent episode of famine, people attacking houses to get food, you know, to still produce, you know, and after a while, people, when you come and you steal my beans, for example. Beans were extremely important because that's the only source of protein. So when you steal beans from a household, you are putting their survival at stake. And what people did, they start to guard their houses and their plots. And when people come to steal, the order reacted by killing.
So,
so there was a violence that.
So how do we now switch to an ethical violence when we had a social more of a social situation?
Yes, because people wanted to take advantage of this desperation, especially political parties. When political parties started in 90, especially in 91, big political parties, MDR and MRND, competed furiously on the hills. So they start to mobilize people to have a following. And those people were using, to lure people in their party, they allow people to start to have, I will say that, to grab land, to blackmail people, you know, just to take advantage of the group that they are creating to get resources. So after, especially MDR, but also MRND, after a while, they start to attack Tutsis. And they start to attack Tutsis because some people needed their land.
So the most vulnerable layer in the society.
They wanted their land. They wanted to root their households and things like that. Yeah.
Does that translate in what you've been observing?
It does, and I think what's particularly important here is that an event like a genocide doesn't come out of nowhere. You know, it's not this random explosion of violence, which some people had described the Rwandan case as, that there was somehow this, you know, kind of crazy, you know, sort of detonation of ethnic conflict. But I think what Jean-Paul's book does extremely well is it shows that there was a slow build-up of multiple events over a 10 or 12 year period that created the conditions whereby the genocide was possible in 1994. Now, that's an extremely important understanding, because if we start to think about how do we watch the warning signs of conflict, how do we potentially even stop it, then I think he gives us a list of factors that we need to be paying very close attention to. And for example, I think the situation that we currently see in Burundi is one where Jean-Paul's analysis may actually be extremely valuable, because I think in many ways we are seeing similar types of low-level violence. And many people think, well, low-level violence, we don't have to worry about that because the death toll's not very high, it doesn't seem to be that explosive. The threshold hasn't been reached. But yet we don't know when the threshold will be reached. So this, you know, for all we know, could be laying the groundwork for something, you know, much more horrendous. Now, let's hope in Burundi that it doesn't get to that point, and that political leaders and a range of actors are able to nip this in the bud. But I think Jean-Paul emphasizes that we need to think about a longer time frame, and that there are a set of processes and elements that, if they are not halted in the immediate, can lead to something much more terrible 10 or 12 years down the track.
So, and that means that, in fact, nobody saw it coming.
In many ways, nobody saw it coming. It was a kind of a slow burn, if you like, because you know, even the kind of low-level violence that Jean-Paul describes in the book, and he goes into, I think, really remarkable detail. You know, he even takes us down to the kind of the cell and the commune level to give us an idea of, you know, this violent contestation over poverty and political contestation. But in those days, my understanding, particularly through Jean-Paul's book, is that, you know, most people dismissed this is what farmers do when they're under pressure. This is what angry neighbours do to one another. This is just part of day-to-day life. But without seeing the bigger picture, which is that if that kind of violence is left to fester, it can lead to something much more cataclysmic at a national level.
Especially when somebody takes ownership of this and use it
and that's the key, and I think that again is a big part of Jean-Paul's analysis, is to say that it's the combination of these community factors and then the role of political leaders at the national level and on the fringes of the country. And so when you get this toxic combination, it's the perfect storm, which is part of Jean-Paul's title. When you get these conditions at the local level plus the final factor, which is political manipulation of those conditions, that's when you get something on the scale of the 1994 genocide.
Maybe I should rebut
Yes.
on this. Those who organized the genocide knew that.
Knew what?
Knew that it would be very, very easy to just put fire on the population, and especially put fire as and giving them a target, and the target will be burned very quickly. They knew that. For one reason, for example, at the time there was also a very class conflict on the hills. People who had a lot of land or something like that were at risk of being poisoned, of being beaten in the night, of seeing people uprooting their coffee trees and things like that, and even local authority. Local authority at the end of the 80s were completely destabilized. People, local authority couldn't tell people as they used to, like 10 years before, go in Uganda, participate in these activities. People just didn't budge. And when they put pressure on them, the population retaliated. So people in power, they knew that they had a time bomb, a ticking bomb at local level. And when they decided to commit genocide, they knew that it would be very, very easy to.
But then,
think.
I would say the last chapter before the genocide comes then also in '90 when the RPF starts an armed struggle in that situation.
Strangely enough, one of the things that I try to test is to see the reaction of the population to the attack of RPF. Mm-hmm. Calm. Okay, a bit of panic maybe for 1 or 2 days, and then total calm. I have to say also that I choose my 2 research sites expressly because of that. I didn't want to be close to the battleground where military violence and tension would have blur maybe the importance of underlying social and political dynamics. That's why I choose Butare and Kibuye. But Butare and Kibuye were also the 2 prefectures with the biggest Tutsi population. So the 2 prefectures represented at the time about 40% of the Tutsi population at the time. And they account for more than about 50% of the Tutsi killed, because many people came from Kongoro and were killed in Butare, tens of thousands. So as I said, I tested it to look at in early October how the population reacted. Almost total calm. That's one thing. Second, also, when the Abiyaman plane was shot, I also looked at how the population reacted at the time, because of the tension that was created by the militia, the Nyeramwes and other militia. and the competition and the fight between political parties was extreme, people thought that it was a continuation of this fight between political parties. So in many instances, Hutu and Tutsi gathered together.
So their perception was that this was another act of the competition in between parties, not what has been widespread as shot by the RPF.
At the time, the Interahamwe's have took the upper hand on their opponents, especially MDR militia, and people thought that the Interahamwe are going to take advantage of this news to attack them, but not attack them on an ethnic line, but on political line. So in many instances, Hutu and Tutsi gathered together, in different places and start to organize themselves to defend themselves against the Interahamwe's. And being in Butare, being in less in Butare, because in Butare there was no that many MRND militia, but in Kibuye, but also in Kigali, in different places. But to the extent that they had to precise exactly the targeting on the third day of the genocide, on the 11th, it became clear, they want to make clear to people that this is not anymore a war between political parties. This, as they used to say, this is a racial war now.
Mm. But by the way, what, according to you, what has been the perception? Because now the struggle started in 90, and the genocide happened in 94. During those 4 years, what has been the perception in those places where you did your evaluation about this RPF in war and the regime and then the leading up to the Arusha agreements and all that? What was it perceived as an ethnical war? Was the RPF perceived as a Tutsi coming to mess them up?
Between 1994, what happened really, what was important politically in a different part of the country that was remote from the battlefield in Kibuye and Butare specifically that I studied, it was political competition, violent political competition between political parties. That was what shook up the lives of people. The competition between political parties created chaos in many communities, and that's what was concerning people, not the war of RPF. The war of RPF was felt quite remote, except in Kibuye, where MRND had still a bit of influence, and then those who were still close to MRND, for them the war against RPF was important. But for the vast majority of the population, it was poverty and political party competition, violent political party competition.
But then when comes the time that the political parties split, I mean, or did they add the power fraction in the, so then it is a real, I mean, a clear narrative on ethnical base or projection, I would say.
Yes.
And this happens mid-90s, no?
Yes, it started, but this were more in Kigali and at the top of political organization, regionally maybe, but at the grassroots. This coming together of different factions on a Hutu basis didn't happen before the genocide. Mm. That's why when the plane of Abiyarimana was shot down, people felt that the violence along the political party will continue. Mm. So this alliance of Hutu power was not yet established at the local level. At the local level, it was still political party as they used to be.
Phil, in the foreign eyes on this whole tragedy, I don't think you ever picked that up, right?
I don't think so. I think that the tendency outside of Rwanda has been always to see this almost exclusively in ethnic terms.
Yeah.
That this was about, ancient hatred between Hutu and Tutsi, that this was manifesting at the local level, that people saw almost all of their problems in life along ethnic terms. Even poverty was seen along ethnic lines, and so it was almost inevitable that you were going to get this big explosion of violence in 1994. But I think, coming back to Jean-Paul's book, what he's showing, I think, an international audience that's very important, is that in many ways the ethnic dimension here only came in at the very end, and it had to be directly manipulated by political elites. It wasn't something that was so deep within citizens that they would just naturally respond to it. They had to be pressured, they had to be coerced, and not just elites at the national level, but also elites at the local level. And actually, local political leaders play a very important part in Jean-Paul's story of the genocide, that it's not just about Kigali-based elites using hate radio to whip up ethnic hatred. It's also the role of political leaders who were maybe slightly more invisible. They were operating at the local level. They knew their communities. They knew what the divisions were. They were able to manipulate the very specific elements of people's lives, particularly economic and ideological tensions. Elites in Kigali often didn't know those local dynamics. They weren't able to manipulate people because they weren't in contact with them. But these local elites were very powerful, very knowledgeable, and were often able to shift this logic towards ethnicity and ultimately to the kinds of violence that we saw in 1994.
We are getting deeper into the mechanics of the genocide. Allow me to take a very, very short break, and we'll be back after this break with Dr. Jean-Paul Kimonyo and Phil Clark. Insights in the genocide of the Tutsi of 1994. Thank you. See you.